The wind howled outside the thick stone walls of the Moscow Kremlin, bringing with it the bitter chill of a Russian winter. Inside the royal chambers, the air was heavy with smoke from beeswax candles, and the quiet tension of a court that knew it had lost its anchor. It was the year 1538, and the Grand Prince of Moscow, Vasily Roman III, had been dead for 5 years. Left behind in a world of ruthless ambition was his son and heir, Ivan, a boy who had barely begun to understand the immense weight of the crown awaiting him. At just 3 years of age when his father passed away, Ivan had been thrust into a position of supreme nominal authority, but absolute power remained a distant dream guarded by fierce and greedy wolves. To understand the man Ivan would eventually become, one must first understand the terrifying isolation of his childhood. His mother, Elena Glinskaya, had acted as regent, attempting to hold together a fragile central government against the relentless tide of ambitious boyars, the powerful hereditary aristocrats of Russia. Elena was a woman of rare intelligence and political will, but she was surrounded by enemies who viewed the throne as a prize to be seized or heavily manipulated. For a brief period, she managed to maintain order, minting new coins, building protective walls around parts of Moscow, and trying to suppress the endless infighting of the nobility. Yet, the boyars resented her centralization of authority and her reliance on her own favorites. In 1538, when Ivan was only 8 years old, Elena Glinskaya suddenly died. Though chroniclers of the time whispered of poison, the exact cause remains shrouded in the dark ambiguities of medieval court politics. Her death was more than a personal tragedy for the young prince. It was the shattering of his entire protective shield. Overnight, Ivan and his younger brother Yuri were left orphans, entirely at the mercy of the very men who had spent years plotting against their mother. The boyars wasted no time. With the royal nursery stripped of parental protection, the Kremlin transformed into a viper's nest of rival factions. The Shaisky's and the Belskys, two of the most powerful and predatory noble families, engaged in a vicious tug-of-war for control of the young sovereign. They did not care for Ivan as a child, nor did they nurture him as a future statesman. To them, he was merely a living banner, a piece of political furniture that lent legitimacy to whichever faction managed to lock him away or bend him to their will. Life in the Kremlin during these years was characterized by neglect, humiliation, and constant peril. Later in life, Ivan would write bitter letters recalling how he and his brother were treated during these dark years of boyar rule. They were often dressed poorly, left short of food, and treated with casual disrespect by guards and nobles who swaggered through the royal halls as if they were the true masters of Russia. Ivan would watch from the shadows as arrogant princes shouted and brawled in the presence of the throne, sometimes dragging their rivals away to imprisonment or execution right before the young boy's eyes. There was no one to dry his tears, no one to offer a comforting word, and no one to teach him the simple warmth of human trust. This atmosphere of perpetual danger forged a specific psychological defense mechanism within the young heir. Trust became synonymous with death. Every smile from a courtier, every polite bow from a noble, and every promise from an advisor was viewed through a lens of deep, unyielding suspicion. Ivan learned to read the subtle shifts in posture, the whispered conversations in dark corridors, and the hidden daggers behind courtly manners. He realized very early that in the highest circles of power, weakness invited destruction, and hesitation was fatal. Yet, this profound loneliness also drove Ivan inward. Denied a normal childhood of play and companionship, he turned to books and religion. The palace libraries held ancient chronicles, religious texts, and historical accounts of great emperors and military commanders. Ivan devoured these writings with a fierce, restless intelligence. He learned about the Byzantine emperors, the Roman Caesars, and the grand princes of Kiev and Moscow who had carved out empires through iron will and unyielding authority. In the quiet solitude of his chambers, he began to construct an idealized vision of what a sovereign ought to be. A ruler standing high above the petty squabbles of subjects, commanding absolute obedience, and striking terror into the hearts of traitors. As he grew from a frightened child into a watchful adolescent, Ivan began to test the boundaries of his captivity. He discovered that, while the boyars were willing to fight among themselves for dominance, they also underestimated the quiet, observing intelligence of the young prince. Ivan learned how to bide his time, hiding his growing resentment behind a mask of outward compliance. He noticed how fear could be used as a tool, observing how the older nobles reacted when power shifted unpredictably. This formative decade left deep, indelible scars upon his soul. The boy who had been abandoned by fate to the mercy of selfish aristocrats slowly transformed into a watchful predator in waiting. The insecurity of his early years did not fade away with age. Instead, it transmuted into a permanent state of hypervigilance. Whenever he looked at the grand halls of the Kremlin, he did not see a home, but a battlefield where one either ruled completely or perished miserably. The lessons of his childhood were harsh, brutal, and enduring, laying down the psychological foundation for a reign that would forever alter the destiny of the Russian lands. The years of silent watching and hidden resentment within the stone walls of the Moscow Kremlin gradually gave way to a new reality. The boy who had learned to read the treacherous glances of the boyars was no longer a helpless orphan waiting in the shadows. He was growing into a tall, imposing young man with sharp, observant eyes and a mind shaped by ancient chronicles, religious texts, and a profound sense of divine destiny. The time of tutelage under the warring factions was drawing to a close, and a momentous transition was about to sweep across the Russian lands, altering the political landscape forever. It was the winter of 1547, when Ivan reached his 17th year, a milestone that marked his coming of age and his formal assumption of supreme authority. For years, the Grand Princes of Moscow had ruled with the title of Grand Prince, acknowledging various historical traditions and navigating the complex hierarchies of power among neighboring principalities and remnants of regional authority. But Ivan looked far beyond the traditional boundaries of his station. Influenced by his deep readings of Byzantine history, imperial tradition, and the spiritual counsel of close advisors, he conceived a bolder, more grandiose vision for his crown. He did not merely want to be first among equals or a localized ruler. He intended to claim a status that placed him on par with the greatest monarchs of Christendom and the ancient Roman emperors. Preparations for the historic ceremony were conducted with immense solemnity and deliberate splendor within the ancient heart of Moscow. The chosen day was January 16, 1547. The Cathedral of the Dormition, inside the Kremlin walls, with its soaring vaulted ceilings, golden frescoes, and flickering candlelight, served as the sacred stage for the coronation. The air inside the cathedral was dense with the scent of frankincense and the heavy breathing of a gathered multitude of boyars, high-ranking clergy, military commanders, and foreign dignitaries. Every eye was fixed upon the young sovereign as he approached the ancient throne, stepping forward with a calm, measured dignity that masked the fiery ambition burning within him. During the elaborate liturgical service, the presiding metropolitan of Moscow performed rites that departed from centuries of local custom. Instead of receiving the traditional hat of monomach merely as a grand prince, Ivan was anointed and crowned with sacred rituals that elevated his title to that of Tsar of all Russia. The word Tsar, derived from the ancient Roman title of Caesar, carried a profound theological and political weight. It proclaimed to the entire world that the ruler of Moscow was an absolute autocrat, ordained directly by God, holding authority that transcended earthly challenges and rival principalities. As the heavy crown of gold and fur, adorned with precious jewels, was placed upon his brow, and the symbols of sovereign power, the scepter and the orb, were handed to him, Ivan stood transformed. He was no longer the neglected child shivering in the palace corridors. He was the anointed monarch of a vast empire, charged with a holy mission to defend and expand the Orthodox realm. The weeks following the coronation were filled with celebrations, feasting, and high expectations. The young Tsar sought to cement his new status by reaching out into his personal life as well, marrying Anastasia Romanovna of the prominent Zakharin-Yuriev family in February 1547. This union brought a brief period of personal happiness and offered the promise of an enduring dynasty. For a moment, the atmosphere in Moscow was charged with optimism. The people, weary of the decades of factional fighting and aristocratic greed that had marked Ivan's minority, looked upon the young Tsar with a mixture of reverence and hope. They believed that a strong, pious, and decisive ruler had finally arrived to bring order, justice, and prosperity to the land. Yet, beneath the glittering surface of the coronation festivities and the newly minted imperial titles, deep structural fractures remained within Russian society. The central government was still heavily dependent on ancient aristocratic networks. Regional rivalries continued to simmer beneath the surface, and the machinery of state administration was antiquated and inefficient. Ivan's grand vision of absolute autocracy was destined to collide with the harsh, chaotic realities of managing a sprawling, decentralized realm where powerful nobles still expected to share in the spoils of governance. This fragile peace and high optimism were shattered in the scorching heat of the summer of 1547. Moscow, a city built largely of timber, was struck by a series of catastrophic fires that broke out in June. Driven by dry winds and wooden architecture packed tightly within the city's districts, the flames tore through neighborhoods with terrifying speed. Churches collapsed, palaces were reduced to ash, thousands of homes vanished into smoke, and countless citizens lost their lives or were left destitute in the ruined streets. The great Kremlin itself was threatened, and the young Tsar and his court were forced to flee the choking smoke for the safety of nearby estates. In the wake of such overwhelming destruction, panic and despair quickly turned into ugly suspicion. Among the common people of Moscow, a wave of dark rumors swept through the devastated marketplace and crowded alleyways. Whispers claimed that the fires were not merely accidental, but the deliberate work of malicious enemies. Accusations specifically targeted members of Ivan's extended family on his mother's side, the Glinskys, alleging that they had used witchcraft or magical potions to burn the city to the ground. The grief and fury of the populace boiled over into open unrest and violent riots. Armed crowds surged through the streets of Moscow, demanding justice, hunting down suspected conspirators, and even breaking into the Kremlin itself to voice their rage. For the young Tsar, who had barely enjoyed a few months of sovereign peace following his magnificent coronation, this sudden explosion of urban rebellion was a profound and terrifying shock. He witnessed firsthand how quickly a loyal crowd could transform into a dangerous mob, and how fragile his newly proclaimed authority truly was when confronted with widespread chaos and popular fury. The riots were eventually suppressed by royal guards and loyal troops. Order was forcefully restored to the smoking ruins of the capital, and the ringleaders of the unrest were punished. But the psychological impact upon Ivan was deep and permanent. The Moscow fires and the violent unrest of 1547 burned away any remaining illusions the young Tsar might have held about the peaceful nature of his rule. It became blindingly clear to him that the entire system of governance in Russia was broken, corrupt, and dangerously unstable. He realized that to survive, and to make his new title of Tsar a true reality rather than an empty title, he could not rely on the old ways or the selfish whims of the boyars. He needed to fundamentally transform the way Russia was governed, sweeping away old abuses, centralizing administrative power, and bending the entire state to a singular, unyielding will. The fires of Moscow did not destroy the young Tsar. Instead, they forged his resolve, setting him firmly on the path toward radical reform and absolute authority. The smoke from the devastating fires of 1547 had barely cleared from the smoldering ruins of Moscow when Ivan recognized that a complete rebuilding of the state was required. The young Tsar, shaken by the violent unrest of the common people and deeply distrustful of the entrenched boyar aristocracy, understood that his newly proclaimed title of Tsar demanded a new apparatus of governance. He could no longer rely on the chaotic, corrupt, and outdated administrative traditions that had defined the Grand Duchy. To forge a centralized, stable empire, Ivan needed intellectual partners, men of capability and vision who shared his desire for systematic modernization. Thus began a remarkable partnership between the young sovereign and a brilliant circle of reform-minded advisors known to history as the Chosen Council. The leading figure of this informal yet powerful cabinet was Alexei Adashev, a man of relatively modest origins whose intelligence, administrative skill, and personal integrity caught Ivan's attention. Adashev became the Tsar's right hand, helping to coordinate state affairs and bridging the gap between the crown and the various administrative branches. Alongside him stood Sylvester, an influential and deeply pious priest from the Annunciation Cathedral. Sylvester brought a powerful moral and spiritual authority to the council, urging the young ruler to govern with Christian righteousness, justice, and concern for the welfare of his subjects. Another key intellectual force was Prince Andrei Kurbsky, a brilliant military commander and educated nobleman who provided crucial insights into both statecraft and the defense of the realm's expanding borders. Together, this inner circle formed a dynamic engine of change that sought to transform Muscovy from a medieval patchwork of feudal principalities into a cohesive, modern centralized state. The first and most pressing area demanding reform was the legal system, which had long been plagued by bribery, local corruption, and conflicting customary laws. In 1550, Ivan and his advisors promulgated a new legal code known as the Tsardom. This monumental document replaced the aging code of 1497 and introduced sweeping improvements to judicial administration. The Tsardom established uniform laws across the entire realm, curbed the arbitrary powers of local governors and judges, and severely punished corruption and bribery among officials. Crucially, it reaffirmed the traditional right of peasants to move from one landlord to another during the period surrounding St. George's Day, providing a measure of legal protection while balancing the interests of the landed nobility. By standardizing laws and ensuring that justice was administered under the authority of the central government, the Tsardom laid the foundation for a predictable and orderly legal culture throughout Russia. Simultaneously, the Chosen Council turned its attention to the sprawling machinery of government administration. For generations, the state had relied on an unwieldy and inefficient system of regional governance, often leading to friction between the central court and local populations. To streamline administration, the reformers developed the system of prikazy, or specialized government departments. Each prikaz was given responsibility for a specific area of national governance, such as foreign affairs, finance, military command, justice, or territorial administration. These offices were staffed by professional bureaucrats and clerks who answered directly to Moscow rather than to local aristocratic families. This bureaucratic innovation drastically improved efficiency, allowed for better collection of state revenues, and ensured that the Tsar's decrees could be swiftly and uniformly enforced across the vast expanse of the realm. Military modernization was another vital pillar of the reform movement. The traditional Muscovite military relied heavily on the feudal levies of boyar cavalry, whose loyalty was often fickle and whose military effectiveness varied wildly depending on aristocratic politics. To create a reliable and professional standing army, Ivan and his advisors established the Streltsy, a corps of elite, firearms-equipped infantrymen. Armed with early muskets known as arquebuses, the Streltsy were permanently maintained by the state, stationed in key cities, and trained in modern infantry tactics. Additionally, the government overhauled the military service obligations of the nobility through the Decree on Service of 1556, which regulated the exact number of armed horsemen a landowner was required to provide based on the size of his estate. These military reforms transformed the Russian armed forces into a formidable modern fighting machine capable of sustained campaigns against well-armed adversaries. Religious and ecclesiastical administration did not escape the reforming zeal of the chosen council. The Russian Orthodox Church was a massive landowner and a powerful cultural institution, but its internal organization and liturgical practices had grown inconsistent over the centuries. In 1551, Ivan convened a major church council known as the Stoglav, or 100 Chapters Council, named after the collection of resolutions it produced. Presided over by Metropolitan Macarius, the council addressed a wide range of ecclesiastical issues, including clerical discipline, the moral conduct of priests, standardized church rituals, and the establishment of local schools to educate the clergy. While the council reinforced the church's traditional authority and property holdings, it also brought ecclesiastical administration into closer alignment with the centralizing goals of the state, ensuring that church and crown marched in relative harmony. These ambitious reforms demonstrated that the young Ivan was far more than a brooding autocrat driven purely by cruelty or paranoia. During this early phase of his reign, he was an energetic, forward-thinking modernizer who understood the necessity of structural innovation. He actively engaged with his counselors, read extensively, listened to diverse perspectives, and supported policies that strengthened the economic, military, and legal foundations of Russia. The collaborative governance of the chosen council brought a period of unprecedented stability, administrative efficiency, and internal peace to a realm that had long suffered from factional discord and institutional weakness. Yet, beneath the productive cooperation of these early years, the fundamental tension between Ivan's absolute vision of royal power and his advisors' desire for consultative governance remained unresolved, setting the stage for future conflicts. The successful modernization of the internal apparatus under the chosen council gave Ivan the administrative and military tools he desperately needed. But the young Tsar knew that a truly great empire could not remain confined to its existing borders. To the east lay a formidable obstacle and a historic rival, the Khanate of Kazan. For centuries, the Muslim Tatar state had sat astride the middle Volga River, a remnant of the once mighty Golden Horde. From this strategic base, Kazan launched frequent and devastating raids deep into Russian territory, carrying off thousands of captives into slavery, disrupting trade along the vital river routes, and bleeding the Muscovite frontier. For generations, previous grand princes had attempted to subdue Kazan with sporadic raids and half-hearted campaigns, achieving little more than temporary truces. Ivan, however, viewed the problem through the lens of absolute central authority. He understood that neutralizing Kazan was not merely a matter of military prestige, but an existential necessity for the security, economy, and future expansion of the Russian state. Preparations for the great campaign against Kazan were exhaustive, meticulous, and unprecedented in scale. Building upon the military reforms instituted by the Chosen Council, Ivan mobilized a massive multi-armed force that combined traditional boyar cavalry with the newly established Streltsy musketeers, and a specialized corps of foreign artillery engineers. The primary challenge was logistical. Kazan was situated hundreds of miles downriver from Moscow, protected by thick wooden walls, deep moats, and a hostile population. Moving an army of tens of thousands of men, along with heavy siege guns and thousands of tons of provisions, through the dense forests and river valleys required a marvel of planning. Ivan ordered the construction of a forward base to secure the supply lines. In a feat of astonishing engineering in the winter of 1550 and 1551, Russian carpenters prefabricated an entire wooden fortress upstream at Sviyevsk, floated the numbered logs down the Volga on rafts, and reassembled the stronghold just 30 miles from Kazan in a matter of weeks. This strategic outpost provided the Tsar with a permanent staging ground right on the doorstep of the enemy. By the late summer of 1552, the Great Crusade against Kazan reached its climax. Tsar Ivan, despite his youth, chose to lead the campaign in person, accompanied by his closest advisors, military commanders, and clergy who carried sacred icons to bless the enterprise. The Russian host converged on Kazan from multiple directions, completely surrounding the formidable fortress city by August. The defenders of Kazan, led by Khan Yadagir Mohammad, fought back with fierce determination, mounting sorties from the gates and showering the besieging camps with arrows and gunfire. The siege proved grueling, testing the patience and endurance of the Russian soldiers who faced rainy autumn weather, muddy encampments, and stubborn resistance from the city's inhabitants. Ivan, stationed in his royal tent near the lines, maintained strict discipline and coordinated the deployment of his forces, demonstrating a cool tactical head that surprised his veteran generals. The turning point of the siege came through the application of advanced military technology and engineering. Ivan brought in a brilliant German military engineer known in Russian chronicles as Ivan Vyrodkov, who supervised the construction of a massive wooden siege tower that towered over the walls of Kazan. More importantly, Russian sappers began tunneling underground beneath the city's defenses, packing barrels of gunpowder into subterranean chambers directly beneath the foundations of the ramparts. On the crisp morning of October 2, 1552, the mines were detonated with a thunderous roar that shook the earth and blew massive breaches into the stone and timber fortifications of Kazan. Through the smoke and flying debris, the Streltsy and elite shock troops surged forward, swarming into the city in fierce hand-to-hand combat. Despite desperate resistance street by street, the defenders were overwhelmed by the sheer scale of the assault, and the citadel fell to the forces of Moscow. The capture of Kazan was a watershed moment in Russian history, transforming the geopolitical landscape of Eastern Europe. For the first time, a major Islamic Khanate was conquered and annexed by the Christian state of Moscow, bringing millions of new subjects and vast territories under Russian sovereignty. The victory sent shockwaves through the neighboring powers, establishing Ivan as a formidable military leader, whose authority was now backed by undeniable conquest. To commemorate this monumental triumph and give thanks for divine favor, Ivan commissioned the construction of the magnificent Cathedral of Intercession on the moat in Moscow's Red Square, a structure popularly known ever since as St. Basil's Cathedral. Its swirling, multicolored domes and unique architectural design captured the wonder and pride of a triumphant nation, cementing the conquest of Kazan in the collective memory of Russia, and setting the stage for even greater territorial ambitions along the great river routes of the East. Following the monumental triumph at Kazan, Tsar Ivan turned his unwavering gaze further south down the great artery of the Russian heartland. To secure total dominance over the region and open uninterrupted pathways to the Caspian Sea, the remaining Tatar stronghold of Astrakhan beckoned. Situated near the mouth of the Volga River, the Khanate of Astrakhan had long served as a strategic nexus for regional trade and a base for hostile incursions. Although Moscow initially installed a compliant ruler to manage the territory, shifting alliances and secret overtures to hostile neighbors soon threatened Russian security. Ivan recognized that true strategic security required direct integration rather than fragile vassalage, setting the stage for a decisive southern campaign. In the summer of 1556, royal forces moved decisively down the Volga River, facing overwhelming pressure from Muscovite regiments and their nomadic allies. The defending leadership abandoned the citadel without a prolonged siege, allowing Russian forces to enter the capital largely unopposed. The peaceful annexation of Astrakhan marked a watershed moment, bringing the entire course of the Volga River under the direct control of the Moscow crown. This sweeping expansion transformed the economic and strategic horizons of the state, bridging European Russia with the Caspian Basin and opening new commercial routes toward Persia and Central Asia. Neighboring steppe peoples, including segments of the Nogai horde and the Bashkirs, soon sent emissaries to declare their allegiance to the Tsar, recognizing the rising preeminence of Moscow. By absorbing both Kazan and Astrakhan, Ivan successfully dismantled the legacy of the Golden Horde's western fragments, cementing his reputation as a transformative sovereign who could reshape the geopolitical map of Eurasia and establish Russia as a formidable multi-ethnic empire. With the mighty rivers of the south now secured under the banner of Moscow, Tsar Ivan turned his attention inward, toward the quiet chambers of his own life, and the person who would become his greatest anchor. Amid the grand halls of the Kremlin, surrounded by plotting boyars and the heavy weight of statecraft, Ivan found genuine solace in a young woman named Anastasia Romanovna Zakharina. Born into a respected noble family that would later found the Romanov dynasty, Anastasia was chosen to be Ivan's bride in the winter of 1547. Their wedding marked a new chapter for the young ruler, offering a sanctuary of warmth and emotional stability in a world where friendship was rare and betrayal was constantly suspected. Anastasia was celebrated by contemporaries not only for her striking beauty and quiet grace, but also for her gentle temperament, profound piety, and deep intelligence. Unlike the fierce and competitive nobles who crowded the royal court, Anastasia possessed a soothing influence over the volatile Tsar, helping to temper his sudden outbursts of anger and grounding him during the most stressful trials of his early reign. For Ivan, who had grown up in an atmosphere of deep-seated insecurity, fear, and ruthless factional struggles following the premature death of his mother, Anastasia became far more than just a wife. She was a trusted confidante, a moral compass, and the only person in the entire realm upon whom he could bestow his absolute trust. As the years progressed, their union was blessed with the birth of several children, expanding the royal family and providing the vital dynastic security that the newly proclaimed Tsardom so desperately needed. The domestic life of the Tsar appeared, for a fleeting period, remarkably stable. Historical accounts from diplomats and court chroniclers suggest that Ivan genuinely loved his wife, often seeking her counsel behind closed doors and sharing in the quiet joys of raising their growing family away from the public eye. During this harmonious season of his life, Ivan's governance reflected a balanced approach to power. Many historians attribute a significant portion of the progressive spirit behind his early domestic reforms, such as the creation of a new legal code, the establishment of local self-government, and the modernization of the military, to the stabilizing presence of Anastasia at his side. She softened the hard edges of his autocratic impulses, encouraging him to listen to his reform-minded advisors and to rule with a sense of Christian mercy and justice rather than raw intimidation. However, the fragile peace of the royal household was destined to face a devastating end. In the late summer of 1560, after roughly 13 years of marriage, Anastasia fell gravely ill. Her health deteriorated rapidly despite the best efforts of court physicians and healers, who could do nothing to halt the mysterious and consuming sickness that weakened her body day by day. As the queen's condition worsened, panic and despair rippled through the royal court, and a profound shadow fell across the Kremlin. The thought of losing the single most stabilizing anchor in his life sent Ivan into a spiral of intense grief and anxiety. When Anastasia finally passed away in August 1560, the emotional blow to the Tsar was catastrophic, fundamentally altering the trajectory of his reign and the psychological landscape of Russian history. Ivan was inconsolable, weeping bitterly at her funeral and staring into a future that suddenly felt bleak, hostile, and terrifyingly lonely. In his grief, suspicion took root in his fractured mind, poisoning his view of the world around him. He quickly became convinced that his beloved wife had not died of natural causes at all, but had instead been deliberately murdered by the treacherous boyars through poison. Though modern medical examinations centuries later would detect high levels of mercury in her hair, consistent with the treatments of the era rather than definitive foul play, Ivan's grief-stricken mind accepted conspiracy as absolute truth. The death of Anastasia Romanovna marked the absolute end of Ivan's cooperative years, stripping away his emotional restraint and opening the floodgates to the deep paranoia, suspicion, and cruelty that would come to define the darker, more infamous decades of his tsardom. With the tragic loss of Anastasia and the fading of the cooperative spirit that once defined his court, Tsar Ivan plunged headlong into a grand and perilous foreign entanglement known as the Livonian War. Following his triumphant expansion down the Volga River and the subjugation of Kazan and Astrakhan, Ivan's ambitions turned toward the west and the Baltic Sea. Russia was landlocked, heavily reliant on northern routes via Arkhangelsk or distant overland paths for its trade with Western Europe. To transform Muscovy into a dominant European power, the Tsar believed he needed direct access to Baltic ports, where merchants, shipwrights, and scholars could freely exchange goods and technology with the realm. This vital gateway, however, was controlled by Old Livonia, a region encompassing modern-day Estonia and Latvia, governed by the Livonian Confederation of German-speaking Crusader knights, bishops, and fragmented mercantile cities. In the late 1550s, citing historical claims, overdue tribute payments, and strategic necessity, Ivan ordered his armies across the western border. The initial phase of the campaign was marked by stunning victories for the Russian forces. Well-equipped and energized by their recent southern triumphs, Muscovite troops swept through the Baltic countryside, capturing the strategic trading hub of Narva and the ancient fortress city of Dorpat, pushing deep into Livonian territory. The local German nobility and fragmented defenders found themselves entirely unprepared for the sheer scale of the assault, and many of their strongholds fell or surrendered with minimal resistance. For a brief moment, it appeared that Ivan's vision of a Baltic coastline was within his grasp, and contemporary observers marveled at the unstoppable momentum of the Russian Tsardom. Yet these early successes proved to be the prelude to a long, exhausting, and ultimately catastrophic military quagmire. The collapse of the Livonian order alarmed neighboring powers who viewed the sudden expansion of Muscovite influence with deep alarm. Soon, powerful coalitions began to form against Russia. The Kingdom of Sweden, eager to secure its own dominance over the Baltic basin, intervened to block Russian access to the sea. Simultaneously, the Grand Duchy of Lithuania and the Kingdom of Poland united under a single crown, marshalling formidable military resources under capable monarchs like Stephen Bathory to push the Russian armies back. What had begun as a swift punitive expedition transformed into a grinding war of attrition that would drag on for decades. As the years wore on, the tide of the conflict shifted decisively against Moscow. The vast logistical demands of fighting a multi-front war against Sweden, Poland, and Lithuania severely strained the Russian economy. Towns and villages near the western border were repeatedly raided and devastated. Trade routes were choked by hostile fleets and armies, and the state treasury was rapidly depleted. Compounding these external pressures were mounting internal frustrations. The military setbacks and strategic stalemates in Livonia deeply unsettled the Tsar, who was already psychologically vulnerable following the death of Anastasia. Accustomed to viewing success as proof of divine favor, Ivan struggled to comprehend why God was withholding victory. In his increasingly suspicious mind, every military failure, delayed reinforcement, or logistical breakdown was not the result of bad strategy or superior enemy coordination, but of deliberate sabotage. He began to suspect that the boyars, nobles, and military commanders serving at the front were secretly working against him, conspiring with Lithuania, or hoping to see the Tsardom fall. This climate of mounting paranoia poisoned the highest levels of government. Advisors who had once helped shape the state were now viewed through a lens of intense distrust. Reports of desertions among aristocratic officers, such as the high-profile defection of Prince Andrei Kurbsky, only served to confirm Ivan's worst fears, convincing him that a vast network of treason permeated the court and the military leadership. The war that was meant to open windows to Europe instead became a mirror reflecting the deepening fractures within Ivan's own psyche, creating an atmosphere of impending crisis, where the Tsar felt surrounded by hidden enemies both abroad and within the very heart of Moscow. The grinding pressures of the Livonian War and the corrosive spread of paranoia brought Tsar Ivan to a momentous personal and political crisis. As the winter of 1564 settled over Moscow, the capital was alive with nervous energy, whispered rumors, and an overwhelming sense of dread. The long military campaigns in the Baltic had failed to deliver the swift triumph Ivan had envisioned. Instead, they had bogged down into an endless cycle of defeats, resource shortages, and strategic stalemates against the combined forces of Poland, Lithuania, and Sweden. For a ruler who genuinely believed that his authority was divine, and that his personal will was intertwined with the protection of heaven, these setbacks were impossible to accept at face value. If God was no longer granting victory to his armies, the fault must lie not with divine will or tactical error, but with human malice. Ivan was increasingly convinced that a vast web of treason was eating away at the foundations of his state from within. In his mind, the boyars, high-ranking nobles, military commanders, and even members of the clergy were secretly working against him. He suspected them of leaking military plans to the enemy, sabotaging supply lines, and plotting to overthrow him. The high-profile defection of his close friend and military commander Prince Andrei Kurbsky to Lithuania had deeply wounded the Tsar, confirming his darkest fears that those closest to him could not be trusted. The court at the Moscow Kremlin had become an unbearable environment of watchful eyes, whispered accusations, and suffocating tension. Ivan decided that he could no longer function under these conditions, and he resolved to take a step that would shock the entire nation and fundamentally alter the political landscape of Russia. On the 3rd day of December in 1564, in the freezing depths of winter, an extraordinary event unfolded in the capital. Without prior warning, Tsar Ivan gathered his family, a select group of trusted personal attendants, and his most precious treasury items, including icons, gold, and state regalia, and departed from the Moscow Kremlin. He did not simply leave on a routine hunting trip or a brief religious pilgrimage. He packed up his entire household and abandoned the seat of central government altogether. The capital was left stunned and leaderless as the royal procession made its way out through the snowy gates of the city, heading north into the forested countryside. The sudden departure of the sovereign left the boyars, the merchants, the clergy, and the common people of Moscow in a state of absolute panic. In 16th-century Russia, the person of the Tsar was not merely a political executive. He was the divinely appointed father of the nation, the supreme protector of the Orthodox faith, and the sole source of law and order. Without a Tsar sitting upon the throne in the Kremlin, the state faced immediate spiritual and political collapse. Rumors ran wild through the streets of Moscow. People whispered that the country was about to be conquered by foreign invaders, that the boyars had murdered the Tsar, or that God had finally abandoned Muscovy because of the sins of its people. The central administration ground to a halt. Courts stopped hearing cases, tax collection ceased, and military orders could not be issued. The entire political machinery of the realm was paralyzed by the absence of its master. For several weeks, the whereabouts of the Tsar remained a mystery to the frantic inhabitants of the capital. Ivan had traveled to the quiet town of Alexandrov, located roughly 70 miles northeast of Moscow. There, behind the thick stone walls of the Alexandrov Sloboda, a fortified royal retreat, the Tsar settled in to wait. He transformed the compound into a heavily guarded sanctuary, surrounded by loyal guards and personal servants, completely cutting off communication with the traditional governing bodies in Moscow. He spent his days in intense prayer, reflection, and strategic planning, fully aware of the immense psychological pressure his sudden disappearance was placing upon the capital. After weeks of calculated silence, Ivan finally broke his quiet exile by sending 2 official letters back to Moscow. The missives were delivered to the Metropolitan, the high clergy, and the Boyar Duma, and their contents sent shockwaves through the highest levels of society. In these letters, the Tsar publicly laid bare his grievances. He declared that he could no longer bear the endless treason, greed, and disobedience of the boyars and the church leaders. He accused the nobility of embezzling state funds, mistreating the common people, failing to protect the borders, and conspiring against his life and crown. With dramatic flair, Ivan announced that he was formally abdicating his throne. He stated that he washed his hands of the responsibilities of governing a people who were ungrateful, treacherous, and unworthy of his leadership. He claimed that he was stepping down to live a life of peaceful retirement and prayer, leaving the realm to its own devices. The impact of this declaration was catastrophic for the ruling elite in Moscow. The boyars and the clergy understood instantly that Ivan's abdication was not a genuine retirement, but a brilliant and ruthless political maneuver. By stepping away from power and blaming the nobility for the crisis, Ivan forced the entire nation to confront the reality of chaos without him. The boyars knew that if the Tsar truly refused to return, they would be held personally responsible by the panicked populace for the destruction of the state. Civil war, peasant uprisings, and foreign invasion would inevitably follow, and the enraged citizens of Moscow would tear the nobility to pieces. A delegation of panicked boyars, senior clergymen, and wealthy merchants hurriedly gathered and prepared to travel to Alexandrov-Sloboda. They carried with them desperate pleas, weeping and begging the Tsar to reconsider his decision and return to the capital. When the delegation arrived at Alexandrov, they found a transformed political reality. Ivan received them not as a weak monarch begging for support, but as an absolute sovereign holding all the cards. He listened to their tearful entreaties with cold detachment. The boyars fell to their knees, groveling and offering him absolute submission, begging him to save Russia from ruin, and promising to root out all traitors and enemies of the crown. They declared that he must rule as he saw fit, without any traditional limitations, parliamentary oversight, or interference from aristocratic councils. Ivan allowed himself to be persuaded, but only on his own strict terms. He demanded extraordinary, unchecked powers to deal with the perceived internal threats facing the Tsardom. He insisted on the right to punish traitors at his own discretion, to execute or confiscate the property of any noble suspected of disloyalty without trial, and to create a separate administrative domain that would answer exclusively to him. The delegation, desperate to secure the return of the sovereign and restore order to the capital, agreed to every single demand. This pivotal political maneuver marked a profound turning point in Russian history. By walking away from Moscow and returning on his own terms, Ivan successfully shattered the traditional power of the aristocratic boyars, who had historically checked the authority of the grand princes. He freed himself from the constraints of the Boyar Duma and established the ideological and practical framework for absolute autocracy in Russia. When Ivan finally agreed to return to the Kremlin in early 1565, he did so not as a constitutional monarch sharing power with his advisors, but as an undisputed autocrat armed with supreme authority and a mandate to cleanse the state by any means necessary. The road had been cleared for the creation of one of the most terrifying instruments of state power in European history, plunging Muscovy into an era of dark and unyielding terror. Upon his return to the Moscow Kremlin in early 1565, Tsar Ivan set into motion the most radical and terrifying administrative restructuring in Russian history: the creation of the Oprichnina. The word itself, derived from an old Russian term meaning apart or separate, described a vast, distinct territory carved directly out of the heart of the Russian landmass. Under this unprecedented decree, the entire Tsardom was split into two separate spheres. The first was the Zemskina, the traditional administrative zone left under the nominal control of the Boyar Duma and ordinary government institutions. The second, and far more ominous sphere, was the Oprichnina, a private domain placed under Ivan's direct, exclusive authority. Encompassing strategic towns, prosperous trading routes, and rich agricultural districts across northern and central Russia, The Oprichnina was designed to bypass all traditional laws, taxes, and legal customs. To govern and protect this personal domain, Ivan established a dedicated force of elite enforcers known as the Oprichniki. Initially numbering around 1,000 men, and eventually growing to several thousand, this corps was hand-picked not from the ancient, powerful aristocratic families of Moscow, but largely from lesser gentry and provincial nobles who owed everything to the Tsar. By elevating men from lower social strata and showering them with confiscated lands and wealth stripped away from the traditional boyars, Ivan forged a loyalist guard whose interests were entirely bound to his own absolute power. The organization of the Oprichnina mirrored a bizarre, inverted monastic order. Ivan appointed himself as the supreme abbot, and his hand-selected commanders wore black, monk-like habits over their armor, waking before dawn for rigorous religious services and prayer. Yet beneath this veneer of ascetic piety lay an engine of ruthless political terror. The Oprichniki rode horses adorned with distinctive and chilling symbols. A severed dog's head attached to the saddle to signify their ability to sniff out and tear apart enemies of the state, and a broom fastened to their whips to represent their mission to sweep treason entirely out of the country. Operating completely outside the jurisdiction of traditional courts, these armed enforcers swept through the estates of the old aristocracy. They seized lands, expelled families from their ancestral homes with only what they could carry, and arrested anyone denounced for disloyalty. The traditional boyars, who had spent centuries advising grand princes and checking autocratic impulses, found themselves helpless against an armed political police force backed by the absolute, unchallengeable will of the sovereign. Land ownership patterns were drastically rewritten, as thousands of aristocratic estates were confiscated and redistributed to the Oprichniki. Those unfortunate enough to be branded as traitors faced rapid imprisonment, property confiscation, and summary execution. While Ivan defended the system as an essential tool to unearth conspiracies and preserve the safety of the state against internal collapse and foreign enemies, the reality on the ground was far more chaotic. The Oprichnina quickly evolved into an instrument of unchecked violence and arbitrary plunder. Bands of armed enforcers roamed the countryside and the streets of Moscow, spreading widespread panic and terror among peasants, merchants, and nobles alike. No one was truly safe from suspicion, and a mere whisper of denunciation was enough to seal a person's doom. By fracturing the unity of the ruling class and instilling an atmosphere of universal fear, the Oprichnina succeeded in crushing the political independence of the old boyar aristocracy, permanently transforming the political structure of Muscovy into a centralized autocracy, fueled by absolute obedience and state-sanctioned terror. By the winter of 1569, Tsar Ivan's mind was consumed by an all-pervasive dread of treason that extended far beyond the immediate circle of the Moscow boyars. His suspicions soon fixed upon Novgorod the Great, the ancient, proud northern city that had once stood as an independent republic before its annexation by Moscow. Reports and denunciations reached the Tsar alleging that Novgorod's elite, led by Archbishop Pimen and local nobility, were actively conspiring to betray the realm and hand the city over to the King of Poland-Lithuania. To Ivan, whose worldview was increasingly defined by a binary struggle between absolute loyalty and treasonous conspiracy, the mere rumor of defection was enough to turn an entire community into a target of deadly suspicion. In December 1569, Ivan mobilized his Oprichniki and set out from his residence at Alexandrov village, heading north toward Novgorod. The journey itself became a slow-moving wave of state terror. As the Tsar's army marched through the towns and villages of Tver and the surrounding districts, detachments of enforcers broke off to ravage local settlements, confiscate property, and arrest anyone suspected of harboring anti-Muscovite sympathies. No town along the route was spared the arbitrary wrath of the advancing guards. By January 1570, the advance regiments of the Oprichnina arrived on the snowy outskirts of Novgorod, sealing off the city and cordoning the surrounding monasteries to prevent any escape. When Tsar Ivan officially arrived with his son and a force of musketeers, the confrontation immediately took on a theatrical and deeply hostile tone. At the bridge over the Volga River, Archbishop Pimen attempted to greet the sovereign and offer a traditional blessing. Ivan rejected the gesture entirely, publicly denouncing the prelate and the citizens of Novgorod as traitors who intended to break apart the sacred unity of the Russian Tsardom. Following this tense encounter, the Tsar entered the city and ordered the systematic arrest of leading clergymen, merchants, and boyars. Monastic treasuries and market stalls were plundered under the supervision of the royal guard, stripping the proud commercial center of its wealth. The weeks that followed saw a sweeping campaign of interrogation and punishment directed from the Tsar's camp. Driven by unyielding paranoia, Ivan utilized torture and swift judicial verdicts to extract confessions regarding the alleged Lithuanian plot. Hundreds of prominent citizens, along with their families and dependents, faced harsh penal measures, property seizures, and execution, while the surrounding agricultural fields and granaries were heavily damaged or laid waste. The episode left Novgorod economically devastated and politically broken, its centuries-old standing as a major regional power, thoroughly crushed under the weight of Muscovite autocracy. The tragic campaign against Novgorod demonstrated the terrifying logical extreme of the Oprichnina system. It proved that the sovereign's fear of conspiracy was no longer confined to political maneuvering within the Kremlin walls, but could be unleashed with devastating force against entire cities and populations. By treating regional independence and civic autonomy as synonyms for treason, Ivan permanently altered the relationship between the crown and its subjects, cementing a legacy where state security was maintained exclusively through universal intimidation and absolute submission. Even as Tsar Ivan directed his wrath inward against his own subjects, a far graver existential threat loomed beyond the southern borders of the Russian state. For years, the expanding Tsardom had locked itself into a draining multi-front struggle, pouring its manpower and resources into the seemingly endless campaigns of the Livonian War. This heavy military commitment left the southern frontiers vulnerable, drawing the eager attention of Devlet I Jure, the Khan of Crimea. Backed by the Ottoman Empire, the Crimean Tatar forces viewed Moscow's aggressive expansion along the Volga River with deep hostility. They sought not only to reclaim lost Islamic territories like Kazan and Astrakhan, but also to exploit the internal fractures and administrative chaos sown by Ivan's own Oprichnina system. In the spring of 1571, the simmering conflict erupted into an unprecedented catastrophe. Bypassing the weakened Russian defense lines along the Oka River, Khan Devlet Jure led a massive army of cavalry straight toward the heart of the Russian state. The royal border forces, depleted and disorganized, were entirely unable to stem the swift advance. As the horde swept through towns and countryside, rural populations fled in terror, packing into the capital for safety until the sprawling suburbs of Moscow overflowed with refugees. Tsar Ivan, confronting an enemy force that far outmatched his immediate defensive capabilities and facing a crumbling military command structure, made the critical decision to withdraw northward toward Alexandrov village, leaving his capital exposed to the approaching storm. On May 24, 1571, the Crimean forces reached the outskirts of Moscow and set fire to the wooden timber suburbs. Fueled by a sudden, violent gale, the flames spread with terrifying speed, engulfing the entire city in a matter of hours. The conflagration became an apocalyptic nightmare for the inhabitants. As heat and smoke choked the streets, people sought refuge inside stone churches and cathedral basements, only for the intense temperatures to cause roofs to collapse and walls to buckle. Thousands of desperate citizens jumped into the waters of the Moscow River, where many perished in the crush or drowned. When the fires finally burned themselves out days later, nearly all of Moscow outside the stone walls of the Kremlin was reduced to blackened ash and rubble, with massive casualties among both civilians and fleeing refugees. The devastation of the capital dealt a shattering blow to the prestige and perceived invincibility of the Tsar. For all of Ivan's absolute authority, his parallel domains, and his ruthless purges of alleged domestic conspirators, his regime had failed in its primary duty, protecting the heart of the realm from foreign invasion. The destruction exposed the profound limitations of the Oprichnina, which had focused heavily on terrorizing internal dissent, while eroding the functional military readiness required to fight external foes. Foreign observers recorded the sheer disbelief that a sovereign who claimed absolute dominion over his subjects could be driven from his capital, leaving a smoking ruin in the wake of a nomadic raid. Emboldened by this monumental triumph, Khan Devlet-Jure demanded the complete restoration of Kazan and Astrakhan as the price for peace, believing that Russia was broken beyond repair. Yet this existential crisis forced a temporary sobering recalibration within the Muscovite government. Recognizing the absolute peril facing the state, Ivan permitted his military commanders, including the capable Prince Mikhail Vorotinsky, to pool the nation's remaining military resources and mend fractures within the command ranks. Just 1 year later, in the summer of 1572, the newly reorganized Russian army met the renewed Crimean invasion at the Battle of Molody, utilizing innovative mobile wooden fortifications known as Gorod to achieve a stunning and decisive victory. Though the danger from the south was temporarily checked, the trauma of 1571 left an indelible mark on Ivan's reign, laying bare the fragile reality underpinning his vision of unassailable autocracy. As the Muscovite Tsardom struggled under the cumulative weight of foreign wars, economic exhaustion, and internal terror, the private life of Tsar Ivan grew increasingly troubled. Deeply central to his dynastic hopes was his relationship with his eldest son and heir, Tsarevich Ivan Ivanovich. The younger Ivan had grown into an educated man who shared many of his father's intellectual pursuits and had spent his youth closely observing and participating in the harsh mechanisms of statecraft that the Tsar had forged. Yet, as the pressures of the protracted Livonian War wore down the stability of the realm, tensions between the aging ruler and his heir began to mount. These strains broke into a devastating personal tragedy in November 1581, culminating in an event that would forever haunt the history of the Rurik dynasty. According to historical accounts that circulated widely among contemporaries and later chroniclers, a violent confrontation erupted within the royal chambers. The dispute allegedly began when the Tsar, prone to sudden fits of explosive rage, confronted his pregnant daughter-in-law, Yelena, regarding her attire, arguing that she was dressed inappropriately for a member of the royal family. The encounter quickly turned physical, resulting in a severe shock that led to the tragic loss of the unborn child. Hearing the commotion and the cries of his wife, Tsarevich Ivan rushed into the room to confront his father, driven by a desperate mix of anger and protective fury over the fate of his family. The argument between the sovereign and his chosen heir quickly escalated beyond control. In a blind fit of unbridled fury, the elder Ivan struck out with his heavy, iron-tipped staff, landing a catastrophic blow to his son's head. As the realization of what he had done washed over the aging Tsar, his blinding anger instantly gave way to shrieking horror and inconsolable despair. Dropping to his knees, Ivan frantically tried to staunch the bleeding and cradled his dying son, crying out in utter anguish as the young man slipped away. Modern historical analysis and scientific investigations into the remains of the Tsarevich have added layers of medical complexity to the event, noting high levels of toxins such as mercury and arsenic in their bones, which suggests that chronic illness or poisoning may have also played a role in the broader deterioration of their health during those turbulent years. Nevertheless, whether the fatal outcome was the direct result of a sudden physical blow or part of a deeper medical tragedy, the political and emotional consequences for Russia were catastrophic. With the death of Tsarevich Ivan Ivanovich, the direct line of succession was fractured. The Tsar was left with only his younger son, Fyodor, a pious and intellectually limited figure ill-equipped to shoulder the immense burdens of an autocratic empire. The loss of his capable eldest son broke something fundamental inside Ivan the Terrible, accelerating his physical decline and deepening his spiritual despair. The tragedy transformed a personal family dispute into a fatal blow to the entire Muscovite state, casting a long, dark shadow over the remaining years of the reign and clearing the path toward ultimate political ruin. As Ivan the Terrible entered his final years, the Muscovite Tsardom presented a picture of profound structural exhaustion and societal breakdown. The grand vision of a centralized, invincible Christian empire, for which the sovereign had sacrificed so much blood, treasure, and human life, lay severely fractured under the cumulative weight of prolonged foreign conflict, economic collapse, and relentless internal political repression. The decades-long Livonian War, once envisioned as the gateway to European trade and maritime dominance, had ultimately degenerated into a strategic and financial disaster. By the early 1580s, facing severe military defeats, exhausted treasuries, and coordinated pressure from the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth and Sweden, Russia was forced to concede its hard-fought Baltic territories through humiliating armistices. The dream of reaching the sea had evaporated, leaving behind an isolated state battered by decades of continuous warfare. Within the domestic sphere, the consequences of the Tsar's radical methods were similarly devastating. Although the terrifying institution of the Oprichnina had been officially disbanded a decade prior, the deep structural scars it left upon the Russian landscape remained raw and unhealed. Vast swaths of once productive agricultural land across the central provinces and the northwest lay completely abandoned and overgrown. Famine, recurrent pestilence, and the constant threat of violent purges had driven terrified peasant populations to flee their ancestral homes in droves, seeking refuge in the southern frontier regions or perishing along the roads. Villages that had once paid steady taxes to the treasury now stood as silent, desolate ruins. The tax base shrank dramatically, leaving the central government unable to properly compensate the service gentry who formed the backbone of both the administration and the military. In a desperate attempt to bind the vanishing labor force to the soil and maintain agricultural productivity, the state increasingly restricted the traditional freedoms of the peasantry, accelerating the grim transition toward institutionalized serfdom. Thus, the mechanisms implemented to secure absolute autocratic power inadvertently locked the rural economy into a cycle of structural stagnation and deep social misery. Even as the physical boundaries of the realm had expanded dramatically through the earlier conquests of Kazan, Astrakhan, and the beginnings of Siberian exploration, the core of the state was hollowed out. The contrast between Ivan's grand ideological pretensions as an absolute Christian autocrat and the grim reality of a starving, depopulated populace became starkly apparent to contemporary observers. The aging Tsar, weighed down by physical ailments, premature aging, and the lingering, unshakable grief over the loss of his eldest son, retreated further into a world of religious penitence and suspicious isolation. He spent hours writing frantic letters of remorse to monasteries, ordering masses for the souls of his countless victims, yet refusing to relinquish the absolute authority he believed was his divine right. The broken Tsardom stood at a dangerous crossroads, having achieved unprecedented territorial scale at an almost catastrophic human and economic expense, leaving the entire socio-political structure dangerously vulnerable to future instability. As the final years of Ivan's reign unfolded, the aging Tsar became a shadow of the terrifying autocrat who had once struck fear into the hearts of princes and boyars alike. Physically broken and prematurely aged by a lifetime of extreme stress, heavy drinking, relentless paranoia, and mercurial rages, the 53-year-old sovereign was now plagued by severe physical ailments. His joints were ravaged by advanced arthritis and spinal deformities, making it agonizingly painful for him to walk or even stand upright for long ceremonies. Foreign ambassadors and visitors to the Moscow Kremlin reported that the Tsar looked far older than his years, with a stooped posture, a swollen and bloated face, and a trembling hand that struggled to hold a pen or a cup. Yet, despite his failing body, his mind remained intensely active, swinging wildly between bouts of paranoid terror, deep religious remorse, and brief moments of lucid statecraft. He spent hours prostrated on the chapel floor, praying for the salvation of his soul, and drafting extensive lists of names of those he had executed, paying monasteries vast sums of money to pray for their departed spirits. At the same time, he kept a fierce grip on power, suspicious of everyone around him, constantly fearing plots against his life, and reacting to perceived threats with sudden outbursts of verbal abuse. His domestic life was equally chaotic and troubled. He had married multiple times after the death of Anastasia, cycling through wives in violation of church canon law, leaving his court unsettled and his succession plans precarious. Among his surviving offspring, his eldest remaining son, Fedor, was a gentle, pious, and physically frail young man who showed little inclination or aptitude for the harsh realities of governance, preferring to spend his time ringing church bells and praying. Ivan recognized his son's weaknesses and worried deeply about the future stability of the realm, knowing that without a strong hand at the helm, the fragile and exhausted Tsardom would easily tear itself apart. In the winter of 1584, Ivan's health deteriorated rapidly. His legs swelled further, and a foul-smelling affliction, likely a form of systemic dropsy or mercury poisoning, accumulated from medical treatments of the era, caused him immense suffering. As he lay confined to his royal chambers within the Kremlin, rumors and prophecies swirled through the superstitious streets of Moscow. Astrologers and court fortune-tellers whispered that the Tsar's days were numbered, and some even claimed that a brilliant star had appeared in the night sky to herald his impending death. Recognizing that his end was near, Ivan sought comfort in various ways, sometimes turning to foreign physicians for miraculous cures, and other times surrounding himself with prognosticators and sorcerers who tried to soothe his troubled mind with herbs and omens. On March 18, 1584, as preparations were being made for a game of chess with his close advisor Boris Godunov, Ivan collapsed. According to contemporary accounts, he suffered a sudden and fatal seizure or stroke while trying to set up the pieces. Panic erupted in the royal chambers as physicians rushed to his side, applying leeches and poultices, but it was too late. The first Tsar of all Russia drew his final breath, leaving behind a nation profoundly transformed, expanded to vast new horizons, yet deeply fractured, economically ruined, and spiritually exhausted. The immediate aftermath of his death was surprisingly quiet in the capital, devoid of the bloody uprisings many had feared, as the transition of power passed smoothly to his son, Fyodor Ivanovich. Yet, beneath the surface calm, the structural weaknesses, the unresolved political tensions, and the deep social wounds inflicted during Ivan's decades of absolute rule created a dangerous vacuum. The death of the formidable autocrat marked the end of an era of unprecedented centralization and terror, while unwittingly setting the stage for the severe dynastic crises and foreign interventions that would soon plunge Russia into the catastrophic period known to history as the Time of Troubles. The death of Ivan the Terrible in the spring of 1584 left behind a country that was vast, powerful, and utterly exhausted. As historians and contemporaries looked back upon his long and tumultuous reign, they found themselves confronting a deeply divided legacy. On one hand, Ivan had achieved what no previous Grand Prince of Moscow had ever managed. He had transformed a regional principality into a sprawling, multi-ethnic empire that stretched from the snowy forests of the north down to the fertile steppes of the Volga, and across the Ural Mountains toward Siberia. He had crushed the independent power of ancient appanage princes and boyar factions, forging a centralized autocratic state where the will of the Tsar was supreme. By adopting the title of Tsar of all Russia, he reshaped the political identity of his realm, claiming a divine right to rule that drew upon the heritage of both the Byzantine Empire and the Grand Princes of Vladimir. Yet, these monumental achievements were inextricably linked to a staggering human cost. The methods Ivan used to consolidate his power, the creation of the Oprichnina, the brutal purges, the destruction of towns like Novgorod, and the endless, draining wars, left deep physical and psychological scars across the Russian land. Entire regions had been depopulated by violence, famine, and flight, as peasants fled south or east to escape taxation and terror. The economy was in ruins, trade routes had been disrupted, and the administrative fabric of the country had been severely strained by decades of suspicion and arbitrary rule. Furthermore, by systematically eliminating trusted advisors and creating an atmosphere where sycophancy and fear were the only paths to survival, Ivan had failed to establish stable, institutionalized mechanisms for political succession. His surviving heir, Fyodor, was ill-equipped to manage the colossal machinery of the state, and the dynastic crisis that followed Fyodor's eventual death would plunge Russia directly into the Time of Troubles, a catastrophic period of civil war, foreign invasion, and social collapse that nearly brought the Russian Tsardom to total ruin. Thus, the legacy of Ivan the Terrible remained a complex and haunting paradox. He was remembered simultaneously as a brilliant, visionary statesman who laid the foundations of Russia's imperial greatness, and as a paranoid tyrant whose cruelties inflicted unspeakable suffering upon his own people. Down through the centuries, writers, Artists and historians would continue to debate his character, trying to understand how a ruler of such high intelligence and profound religious devotion could descend into such depths of violence and terror. In the end, Ivan left behind a nation that was undeniably stronger on the geopolitical map, yet profoundly